Començo? Okay, let's start. Well, good morning, everybody. Today, well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Martí Galí. And I'm doing that on behalf of Rafael Simó, who is sick at home, so we hope Rafael recovers soon. And then, well, most of you already know Martí, but for those who don't, I just tell you that I'm going to tell you that he did the PhD at the ICM a long time ago. Well, not that long, but he finished like 10 years ago, in 2012. And then after that, I guess he wanted to experience a colder climate, so he moved to Quebec in Canada, and he spent a few years there. He was until 2018, so about 5-6 years. And then there he was at the Université Laval, no? And then he was doing as a postdoc, and then he came back to Barcelona doing work at the Supercomputing Center in Barcelona. And I guess he wanted to come back to the warm weather of Catalonia, and I'll tell you something about that later. And then after working at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, he got a permanent position here at the ICM, and he started in 2021, is that right? So that's what he's doing the research now, okay? And then, well, among other things, he's leading a SCORE working group called DMS Pro. It's it's a cool name, Pro. My kids will like it as well. He would say, you are very pro. And this is an international initiative to catalyze the study of the upper ocean sulfur cycle, which is one of the topics that he's doing research on. And when I told you that he was coming to the warm weather of Catalonia, I really meant that, because I think there's quite a connection between Martí's and warm weather. And here in Catalonia we have l'estiuet de Sant Martí. It's like the little summer of Sant Martí. And it happens that today is Sant Martí, so I don't know if that was on purpose or not. So congratulations for the day. And well, without further ado, we're really eager to listen to your talk titled Mapping Marine Emissions of Reactive Trace Gases to Understand Their Role in Weather and Climate. So the floor is yours.
Hola, bon dia a tothom. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Carlos, for the introduction. The nice introduction, in fact. And so thanks for having me today here at the ICM Talks. And as you see here, I'm going to talk today about giving a perspective on approaches we have been using to map the concentrations and emission of trace gases and to understand the role in weather and climate. And this distinction between weather and climate is an important one in this talk, as you will see later. So this is a brief outline. I will start with some introductory background information. Then I will kind of review different approaches to do this mapping of reactive gases, from climatologies to remote sensing, algorithms, and other approaches. And finally, we'll propose some ways to move forward to advance this research field. So this is the introduction. Why do we need synoptic fields of reactive gases? And I wanted to start this introduction with this diagram. It's a classical, very famous kind of diagram called Stommel diagram, which is useful to see at a glance that geophysical phenomena in the ocean and the atmosphere span an enormous range of scales. So here you see temporal scales, horizontal scales, and we also see here that because like air and water move at different speeds, have different properties, of course there is a mismatch between the characteristic length scales and their characteristic time scales in the ocean and the atmosphere. And this is the first challenge we have to overcome in ocean-atmosphere interaction studies. So it is common to distinguish between weather and climate scales, and this diagram is useful also to show the enormous gap between weather and climate, right? So here I have highlighted in bluish colors what we call typically weather, which we define over multi-year or few decades, periods that last a few decades at least, which is defined by, it's a prevailing state, it has some regularity and so on. And weather which is related to individual events on the time scales of, like, say, hours to days to a few weeks at most. These are events that we can observe synoptically, so all simultaneously over a large area. There is physical coherence in the physical flow patterns, for example, and so on. And finally, when we are unable to resolve some scale, we call this noise. But, so why do we care about this? Why am I using this diagram to introduce this talk? Well, because when we talk about reactive cases that are short-lived in the atmosphere, so they react in the atmosphere in a time frame of hours to days, we are talking about phenomena that occur primarily on the weather time scale, right? So blooms in the ocean that affect the emission of these volatiles, and NPF is new particle formation, so the formation of aerosols that is promoted by these gases, and aerosol growth, their transport, aerosol cloud interactions that are very important to climate, they all occur on meteorological time scales. And this is well illustrated by a gas that I have studied in depth, which is dimethyl sulfide. But it's important to note that in this talk, I'm not talking about DMS only. I rather want to use DMS as a model system, because it's a gas we know a lot about. We want to use it as a model system that can shed light on the study of reactive gases and their role in weather and climate. So, dimethyl sulfide is a gas that has caught lots of attention because of its role in the formation of aerosols and clouds. And because of that, we have learned a lot over the last decades from the molecular genetic point of view up to the food web dynamics and the larger scale emission, right? So we know that dimethyl sulfide is a gas produced through the breakdown of a precursor compound that is made mostly by phytoplankton, which is called DMSP, dimethyl sulfonylpropionate. And we also know that dimethyl sulfide is removed by some biotic and abiotic processes, and this is the major pathway that finally redirects this compound to non-volatile sulfur compounds. But some of the DMS is emitted to the atmosphere, and there it is involved in many atmospheric processes. First of all, DMS is oxidized within a time frame of hours to days through different pathways, and the stable compounds of this oxidation are sulfuric acid or methanesulfonic acid. And these compounds are involved in the formation of new particles in the atmosphere, so the nucleation, and also in the growth of pre-existing particles. Then these particles can grow through the addition of other compounds, can grow large enough to take up water vapor, and when they do that, they can act as cloud condensation nuclei. And when they do so, when you have more cloud condensation nuclei, and you can increase the albedo of the clouds, but also the short and the long wave radiative effects, so the heat trapping, they can impact also in precipitation and so on. Okay, so this is DMS, and going back to this, the important thing here is that most of the knowledge we have about these compounds comes from observation, like from ship surveys, ship cruises, comes from fixed stations, from controlled experiments, mesocosms, or microcosms, which cannot access all the relevant spatial-temporal scales, right? So we know we need other types of data to upscale and to map these volatiles. So satellites, autonomous observation platforms in general. But unlike people who study the changes in chlorophyll or sea surface temperature, we cannot observe these compounds directly, so we need reconstruction techniques. We need statistical techniques or prognostic models, and so on. So now I'm reviewing some of the approaches we have been using to do that, and asking or evaluating whether we are using them appropriately or how we can do better, because it's quite clear that we can do better, as you will see. So this is the central part of the talk. And well, this figure is comparing three approaches to do that would ideally, well, these three maps should ideally look the same, but they don't. So this is the enigma of this part of the talk that you will see it by the end of the section, what this corresponds to. So I'm starting with the most popular approach to map the concentration of reactive cases, and in particular dimethyl sulfide, which is the calculation of interpolated climatologies. And there is a saga of these climatologies starting in 1999. There was another update published in 2011, and the third update of this sea surface climatology of dimethyl sulfide was published this summer. And to explain you a little bit how these climatologies are calculated, here you can see a map with all the measurements that are currently available in a global database of sea surface concentrations. And essentially we are using these measurements and a number of interpolation techniques to come up with monthly maps of dimethyl sulfide at the sea surface. And this third climatology that was recently published, it has lots of improvements in the methods used to interpolate this data, and also because there is a lot more measurements now than 10 years ago, because now we have measurement systems that allow for much higher frequency of measurement. So we have increased from about 50,000 to nearly 1 million individual measurements. So how are these climatologies constructed? Well, first, we bin all the measurements according to biogeochemical regions or provinces, as you see here, and months. And with this, we create a canonical seasonal cycle for each biogeochemical province. And as you can see here, it's a bit, this approach is not free of issues, because, first of all, because even though it looks like there is a lot of measurements here, in some areas, see, can I start again? Yes, okay. So I'm recovered from the dizziness now. I think it was this graph that was making me dizzy because of so many panels. Yes, I see some agreement in the public. So, so basically the idea of the climatologists is to create these canonical seasonal cycles in each of these regions that you see in colors in this map. And this approach has been followed in the successive climatologies I was talking about, but in this last one there was an improvement, and it's the use of dynamic boundaries. So these boundaries between regions move from one month to another, from one year to another, to try to capture within each region the most characteristic conditions, right? And then when we have these average fields for each of these regions, we apply the optimal interpolation, which for each of the grid cells or pixels uses a radius of influence to include measurement in the calculation of this value. And another innovation of this last climatology is the use of a variable radius. So taking into account that oceanographic structures can have different dimensions in different latitudes and in different regions. Good, so as I was saying here, this approach has some issues. First of all, because it gives us a static view of the seasonal cycle. By definition, it's a climatology. Also because there is sampling issues, because of the sparse sampling, because there is no repeat sampling, so one particular area is almost never sampled on a given month in different years. So we may be confounding spatial and temporal variations and so on. It's not very appropriate for regions with high variability, with very sharp gradients. And it also suffers because of the skewed distribution of the sampling, and in particular that we have a tendency to sample always in bloom conditions and in summer, so some conditions are underrepresented. And to overcome these limitations, the second most popular approach that has been used is the development of empirical algorithms. And this idea is not new. In fact, some of the first algorithms were proposed back in the early 90s. But now this approach is more viable thanks to the larger abundance of measurements. And what we do in this case to develop these empirical algorithms is to put together, to match up these in situ measurements that I was talking about, this global database or regional databases as well, and to collocate this with other variables that we estimate, that we assume that can be good predictors of our compound of interest, right? So in the case of DMS, we typically have used the mid-layer depth, and nutrient concentrations, chlorophyll, sea surface temperature, irradiance, and we merge this data, we develop empirical fits, and then produce maps of the dimethyl sulfide or other compounds. And what is curious is that this approach has been used mostly to produce climatologies, but it's much more interesting to produce time series, right, with interannual time series that cover the entire satellite record, for example, to analyze things like interannual variability. And this is what I wanted to talk about more in detail now, because it's an approach that I have been using in the last years to map DMS and to study its effects on climate. So I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about the satellite algorithm I developed and when I was a postdoc in Quebec. And it's not very different from pre-existing algorithms, but the novelty here perhaps is that I brought the methodology, the classical methodology in satellite remote sensing to the field of reactive cases. So I did the matchups between satellite observations and dimethyl sulfide with very strict matchup criteria, so making sure that I was using only daily data representative of those particular measurements, and with like a small time window. Then I used this matchup data and sulfur measurements to develop the predictive equations. I did a validation with independent subsets of the data. And here you see an example of this validation. You have the measured and the estimated DMS. And then I applied this over the entire time series, going from daily observations to the 19-year interannual time series. And I also wanted to mention that in this algorithm, there is also some distilled knowledge process behind the structure of the equations. So sometimes it's called a semi-empirical approach. And what we did is to apply this to a particular region, and which is the Arctic. Why the Arctic? Well, because the Arctic is a region that is undergoing, as you know, like dramatic changes in sea ice extent, in terms of warming, which propagate to the marine ecosystem and the atmosphere. And here you see, first of all, a comparison between the interpolated climatology I was talking about. In this case, is the climatology of Arantxa, Lana, and colleagues in 2011, and the satellite based climatology, so based on 19 years of satellite observations. And this is the mean spatial distribution of dimethyl sulfite in summer in the Arctic. And as you can see, there is sharp differences in terms of the spatial distribution. In the satellite product, we see much sharper spatial gradients from the coast to the central Arctic Ocean, and differences as we move from the Atlantic or the Pacific to the central Arctic, and so on. And here it's interesting to focus on a particular region that has undergone the most dramatic changes, which is the high Arctic, which we define here as north of 70 degrees. And we focus on this region to analyze interannual changes. And we found some expected results and some unexpected results as well. So our hypothesis was that as the sea ice extent decreases in summer, there will be more open waters, so more waters that can directly emit to the atmosphere. We are removing the lid, and there is more flux to the atmosphere. And we did find this response, as you can see here, because estimated that the DMS emission was increased in parallel to the change in sea ice extent in ice-free waters between the late 90s and 2011. But we also found a period with decreasing emissions, and also here after 2011, despite that the ice-free extent was not decreasing, was rather oscillating, right? And this is because, well, this indicates that changes in the marine productivity were also affecting the DMS emission. So this is a result that we could have not obtained without this satellite approach, and indicates there is an interplay between the physical control that imposed by sea ice and the productivity of the marine ecosystem that depends on many different processes in the Arctic, like light and nutrient availability from different sources. And this approach is also, because here to obtain these trends, we have to aggregate an enormous amount of data. But this approach is even more interesting when we look more in detail in a particular region, when we zoom in. And this is what I wanted to do here now. I'm going to zoom in the Barents Sea, this sector in orange, to look more in detail at the spatiotemporal variability in this area, and why this variability matters for weather and climate. So here you see a map of the Barents Sea, and you see this box here. And it's a region that is quite particular because it's where the Atlantic inflow here and the polar waters in the north meet. So the Atlantic inflow brings warm, salty water, and also temperate species into this area. And this is what you can see here in this image, taken by the MODIS Aqua satellite on July 2015. You can see there is a bloom of coccolithophores, which is typically of Amylella huxleyi, which is a temperate coccolithophore species. And this kind of delineates the location of the polar front. Okay, so here I'm showing that for this particular region, if we look at different years, for example, 2014, 2015, 16, we have contrasting distributions and magnitudes of sea surface and DMS concentration, and none of them resembles the climatology derived from satellites, which is a lot smoother. And if we take the entire time series, like from 1998 to 2016, and collapse it, we can see that there is no individual year that looks like, well, that all years look like quite different in this region. There is a high amplitude in the peak magnitude, also in the timing of the annual peaks. And this illustrates that the concept of climatology in this area is not that useful. And I wanted to show also a kind of conceptual, computational experiment I did using the satellite dimethyl sulfide from this area. And now you imagine that this is the true distribution of sea surface dimethyl sulfide. And we sample this domain randomly on different years, on different periods of each year. In one case, we sample 50% of the domain, like using a high-frequency measurement system, like from the ship underway. And we obtain these points in black. And then we do the same, but using a measurement that allows us to measure only like half and 2.5% of the domain over the same period, because we have to do discrete measurements, like with the classical methods we use to measure DMS. So and then we use these measurements, which are sampling the domain, to create a climatology. And this is what we obtain. In black is the climatology we would obtain sampling 50% of the domain. In cyan is what we would obtain sampling a much smaller fraction of the domain. And in red, you see that the true climatology we would compute from satellite observations, from the satellite algorithm. And well, they're not that different, but there is a disagreement. Now we redo this again. And this is what we obtain. As you see, the patterns have changed. And this is the kind of discrepancy we observe when we compare the satellite product with the interpolated climatology. So with this kind of data, we can also better design the measurement campaigns and decide where to put efforts and what is the optimal sampling in different regions. If we did the same exercise in subtropical gyres, we would obtain much more like stable and more results that would look like more similar to the climatology, to the known climatology. Good. Then, of course, when we have these concentrations in our region of interest, it's important to know that one thing is the sea surface concentration, and another thing is the emission, which depends on the interaction between concentration fields, winds, and sea surface temperature. And of course, you see that the peak in concentration and emission do not have to be coincident. And this is interacting with the meteorology. So these emissions will encounter also different conditions and will impact aerosols and clouds differently. And finally, another important bit here is that, well, now I put the 19-year time series of DMS in this area, and along with it, the time series of chlorophyll, which we typically use as an indicator of phytoplankton biomass, time series of particulate inorganic carbon, which we use as an indicator of the biomass of calcifying phytoplankton, like this Emmylania huxleyi in this region, or primary production. And as you can see, each of these variables have different interannual trends, interannual variability. And it's very common in atmospheric studies to use only chlorophyll as a proxy for like ocean-emitted volatiles. But when we look at these variables, we realize that depending on the variable we look at, we obtain very different pictures. And it's important to keep this in mind. And well, with the upcoming satellite missions like PACE that will have hyperspectral resolution, and we'll be able to resolve like in more detail some of these compartments, and it will be even more interesting to look at these trends of different phytoplankton groups in these changing regions like the Arctic or the Barents Sea. Okay. So one thing I didn't anticipate when I developed this satellite product is that there would be a lot of atmospheric scientists interested in using that as input for their analysis. And this made me realize that there was a big demand for this kind of time and space resolved emission data. So for example, when you have these maps of reactive gases, you can use them as input for back trajectory studies. So you have a measurement station, for example, here in the Svalbard Islands, and you analyze where the air masses are coming from or how they are interacting with the waters or ice beneath. And it's also very useful to have these time and space resolved fields as input for atmospheric chemistry models or atmospheric chemical transport. And this is something we did in collaboration with scientists in Environment Canada. So for example, here you see this study where there was a in situ time series of DMS at the sea surface, which you can see here in blue and orange. The measurements taken in situ with different methods. And these were used, and sorry, I'm not explaining properly. So they measured DMS, but not in the air with different methods, and this is what you see in blue and orange. And then they use different products like satellite climatology, this one, or the interpolated climatology here, as input for an atmospheric chemistry model, trying to reconstruct the observations. And here we see that in some cases there is good agreement, and in these particular cases the satellite product is helping us to understand, to predict better the peaks in atmospheric DMS, but in some cases there is a strong disagreement, which indicates that we are not doing well enough in some cases. And this brings us to the next approach that I wanted to talk about, which is the use of artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques to do this upscaling of reactive gas concentrations. And essentially, this is not very different from what we do in the empirical feeds, but the statistical techniques that are involved in this are much more complex, because instead of typical multilinear regressions and so on, we are using these neural networks or random forests or other techniques of the kind. And one particular thing about these techniques is that they require huge amounts of data, so they are not feasible for all compounds. They also use many predictor variables, sometimes climatological ones, which is kind of contradictory, but this is what is being done. And they come up with these maps of reactive gases. And here I'm showing a comparison between the predictive power of classical techniques like multiple regression in the case of DMS, and a machine learning technique like artificial neural networks. And as you can see, these techniques are much better at explaining variability. So although they are sometimes criticized because they are a black box, so it's hard to understand how they behave and how they achieve this predictive power, they can be really useful because of this high predictive power. And this brings me to this slide where I want to show this study which compared directly these three techniques: the interpolated climatology of DMS, the satellite algorithm I was talking about, the one I developed with colleagues in Quebec, and the neural network. And what is interesting here is that there is still a lot of disagreement, right? In some areas we see similar patterns and similar concentration ranges, but in some others there is a strong disagreement. And this is the status of our predictive capacities right now. So there is a lot of room for improvement. And what is even more interesting here is that when we compare the range, the typical spread of observations that you can see here in red, to the predictions of these different methods, this is the climatology, satellite, algorithm, and machine learning, none of them is able to capture the actual variability, the actual spread of the data. So our ability to represent extremes is very, very limited. And this is important, this is relevant. Okay, so the last part of this review of the methods is about prognostic modeling, but I don't want to go very deep into that because, well, this would require another talk in itself. And there's people more qualified than I to talk about that. But I just wanted to say that when we look at the different models that are being used to predict dimethyl sulfide or other reactive gases, there is a wide diversity in terms of structure and of the processes that are represented. And depending, well, probably the key question here is what are we using the models for? So we want to use them for mechanistic understanding or for budgeting, for filling the gaps and producing like maps. We want to make short-term predictions. We want to make long-term projections, like for climate change scenarios. And depending on our questions, we can use different types of models. But in general, what we find currently is that prognostic models have very limited ability to capture the concentration patterns of dimethyl sulfide. And this uncertainty increases as we move from zero-dimensional models to water column models, regional global models, and to CMIP and to climate change projections. And here you can see, for example, the comparison between in situ DMS and in 5 by 5 degree bins and the DMS from a couple of different models that are currently being used in the CMIP exercises that are informed the IPCC report and so on. And you see that the scatter is huge and the model's ability to represent the actual variability is very limited. And this is not surprising because when we have a trace gas model, for example, a model for DMS, we are piling up different sources of uncertainty and different biases. And sometimes you are compensating biases in one model, in one submodel, like in the ocean circulation model, with biases in the ecosystem model and then the trace gas model. And this becomes worse as we move up in this scheme here. Great. So to conclude this part of the talk, I wanted to compare a little bit the different approaches that I have been talking about, so objective interpolation, empirical satellite algorithms, machine learning, and prognostic models. This is it's very subjective, of course, and I wanted to compare them in terms of the efficiency with which they use available observations, simplicity, goodness of fit, resolution, dynamic range, or ability to represent extremes, and mechanistic assessment or understanding, and the predictive skill. And the idea in general is that in terms of upscaling a small amount of observations, empirical algorithms with some mechanistic knowledge embedded in them, or prognostic models are the best tools. In terms of simplicity, probably interpolation or empirical fits are the easiest to understand. But in terms of goodness of fit and resolution, it's hard to beat these machine learning algorithms or prognostic models. And also in terms of the dynamic range of the variability that we can represent. Finally, if what we need is a process level understanding, we have to go for prognostic models. And in terms of the predictive skill, it's largely unknown, I would say. So it's very hard to trust the predictions these models are making about climate change scenarios, for example. Good. And with this, we arrive to the final part of the talk, where I want to review a little bit the challenges that we are facing to do better in the mapping and generally speaking, the prediction of the concentration fields of these compounds, of DMS and other reactive gases. So one first challenge it's important to keep in mind, I think, is the ability to represent extremes, as I was talking just before. And why is this important? Well, we know that with climate change and global change, we are not only changing the mean state of any given variable, but also the variability range, the spread, the distribution. And this is just one possible scenario, for example, where the mean is shifting upwards, but also the variability is increasing. And well, when we think about the heat waves we had in this year, it's quite obvious, right? So if our models are unable to reproduce the whole spread of the variable of interest, it's unlikely that we can understand how it will interact with how this reactive volatile, or this is more general, how this will respond to climate change, or how it will interact with other parts of the climate system. In relation to that, it's also very important to keep in mind that these variables and these processes we are talking about typically respond in a nonlinear manner to different forcings or to different processes. And in this case, what happens is that to project the response, it's not enough to use the mean value in the future, but we need to consider the full range of variability, the fluctuations. And this has been known for over a century. It's called Jensen's inequality, or the fallacy of the average, and says that the response to average conditions here is different to the average response to fluctuating conditions. And this is appropriate for both physical and biological systems, and is illustrated here, right? This is the response, which is nonlinear. So the response at the average conditions is different from the average response in fluctuating conditions. And this is one physical example. This is one example for a metabolic rate and body temperature, and this typical power law increase. And recently there was an interesting paper that came out talking about this same phenomenon, the Jensen's inequality, or the fallacy of the average, for different kinds of organisms. And I found just interesting that these researchers just did this study that fits perfectly with the idea I wanted to convey in the previous slides. Well, another important thing is whether we are tackling the problem at the right with the right resolution, and this is something that is becoming increasingly clear in the field of climate, but we are not yet at this level of maturity perhaps in ocean biochemistry and aerosol studies. And I think we should worry about whether the models that we are tuning to reproduce climatological patterns and at core resolution, like you see here, will be able to project the changes or to capture the strength of the interactions, because they are representing many of the processes in an implicit way, but not explicitly. They are not resolving the right scales, the weather that I was talking about. And this has been seen, for example, in the case of interactions between waves and wind-wave interactions, and also in high-resolution physical models, ocean atmosphere coupled models, but we are still very a long way behind in ocean biochemistry to move to the sufficient resolution. And finally, Another challenge, when we consider the role of extremes and of the fluctuations, is that, okay, I have been talking about DMS only so far, but there is tens of relevant compounds that are being exchanged through the RC interface. Like, well, here you have sulfur compounds, other sulfur compounds, we have halocarbons, we have ammonia, amines, we have non-methane halocarbons, like alkanes, alkenes, isoprene, and so on. And all these compounds probably have different distribution patterns that are interacting in ways that we don't really understand. And we don't know if by missing these co-emission patterns of different compounds, we are missing their interaction in the atmosphere and their role in aerosol and cloud interactions. Great. And with this, I arrive at the really final part of the talk, proposing some ways forward. So, one first important thing I think we need is more large-scale coordinated experiments involving measurements in the ocean and in the atmosphere. And there has been just a few of them in recent years. I can mention Mosaic in the Arctic. There was the NAMES expeditions in the North Atlantic here. And there was NetCare also in the Arctic. But there is a need to do this kind of coordinated experiments with probably more than one ship and also flights in critical regions like the Southern Ocean, where natural aerosols emitted by the ocean are critical for the formation of aerosols on clouds. We also need an effort to translate the process level understanding we have from the measurements from ships, like in situ, into prognostic models. And because now, if we look at the current Earth system models that are using for example, in CMIP, we see that very few of them are representing feedbacks between ocean and atmosphere that involve dimethyl sulfide or other reactive volatiles. So most of them only have the feedback through the CO2 exchange. And to catalyze these aspects, these activities, we put together a proposal for a SCORE working group, and it was recently approved like last month. And this working group is called DMS Pro. And essentially, it is we are a group of 20 people from all these countries, and our goals are diverse, but we have two very specific goals, which are to create a public database of the cycling rates of sulfur compounds that are involved in this, sulfur compounds like DMS and related compounds, to make this available and for modelers, for example, to be able to translate this knowledge into prognostic models. We're also creating standard operation practices, like standard protocols for the measurement of these transformation rates. And we are also planning to do some training events and more generally to establish a global community of practice around the study of these compounds. And the general goal is to bridge the gaps between the molecular knowledge and in situ rates, actual rates at which these compounds are being produced and consumed and emitted, and the biogeochemical models. And finally, I also think we need to move forward towards the inclusion of these compounds in reanalysis products. So you know that reanalysis products typically, in a reanalysis product, we have a model which is constrained by observations, which is used to produce new predictions, and in this way, the model can assimilate observations and refine step by step the predictions. This is an approach that has been used for decades in weather prediction, right? When we in weather prediction. And with more recently, very different entities have been producing reanalysis for aerosols in the atmosphere, which are very useful because they can be used to infer what type of aerosol were being transported and emitted or deposited in a given area. So I think that it would be a great advance to have this kind of products for the emission of trace gases like the methyl sulfide and others. And this would satisfy this demand from the atmospheric scientist side of resolved fields of emission for trace gases. And that's all for today. So the take-home messages are here, but I will read them also. So it's critical to understand the role of reactive gases to be able to map their distribution in space and time, because we need to know when and where emissions are taking place, not just the mean field. And the diversity of approaches that I reviewed is important because they are complementary and they can be used to tackle different questions. And finally, we need these coordinated efforts to improve the mapping of these compounds. And this involves refining observational strategies, the methodologies we use to acquire the measurements, and how we translate this process level knowledge to prognostic models, and blend them with this observation from satellites and other autonomous platforms and so on. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Martí, for this very nice talk. I'm glad you've been able to keep going.
A bit eventful.
Are you okay now? All right, so if you have questions, let's go ahead. Yeah.
So nice talk, Martí. Actually, I think it's the third time I listened to your talk, so I should have asked this question earlier. But I saw you presented some machine learning methods, and you say they have a better fit to observations than other methods, but they are also more complex. Well, with a complex enough model, you can always have a very good fit, but it does not mean that you get a lot of information from your system. Yeah. You should at some point error square of 0.66.
Yeah.
I would like to know how exactly it is estimated. Is it you or somebody else use a machine learning technique to fit model to data using all the data available and they get this fit, or did they use half the data to train their model and estimated the fit with the other half?
Yeah, so typically they split the data into development and validation data sets, and in proportion of say 50-50 or 80-20% at most, and these are squared. If I remember well, it represents a validation data set, or it should represent a validation data set. But I agree with you that the more parameters you have in your model, the better you can fit anything, but this doesn't mean that you are gaining understanding. No? I completely agree with that. And so that's why I say that depending on your goal, these methods can be very useful, because if you want to map this compound in present day conditions that match the measurement period, right? Not in future conditions. to produce the best possible maps as input for atmospheric models, maybe this approach is the best one. But this doesn't mean it's good for making predictions, because there is a risk of overfitting in these approaches, because you have many parameters, and basically there's a risk of making the models too good, no, and too specific for the particular data set they are being trained with. So they in this case they lack general applicability, and they are not able to make good projections in conditions like outside of the observation range.
Okay, thank you. At least from the methodology you explained at the beginning, it's they did the right way. I was worried that they only have one set, and in this case it would be easy to have a very high fit, but it's not the case.
Yeah, no, I think they are, in terms of validating the fit independently, the more recent papers I have seen, they are using more robust methods for validation, but still they do with sometimes contradictory things, like claiming that they are achieving very high spatiotemporal resolution, but then they use as predictors climatological variables, like satellite products or climatological nutrient fields that are produced by optimal interpolation or by averaging over long periods and large regions. And how can you then use these climatological fields to predict what is going on at this particular place and time, right? It's a bit contradictory.
Okay, more questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Martí, for this talk.
Thanks. Yeah.
Perhaps I missed it, and this is perhaps a very obvious question, but I'm wondering which is the primary data from the satellites that is used to get the concentration of DMS in the water?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't explain this well enough. So this depends. But in most cases, we are using chlorophyll and sea surface temperature. We can use also particulate organic carbon eventually, or particulate inorganic carbon. And in the case of the algorithm I developed, it's a bit more complex because it has two steps. So the idea here was to be half empirical, half mechanistic. So we are predicting first the precursor compound DMSP, and we predict DMSP from chlorophyll, SST, euphotic layer depth, which we can also retrieve from satellite. Particulate inorganic carbon peak as well, it comes from satellite, and the mixed layer depth is climatological, but we use it in a categorical way, so it's not having a big influence on the result. And then we use this DMSP to estimate DMS. And in this case, we include the effects of light, which is also retrieved from satellite, because we know that the conversion from DMSP to DMS depends on light to a large extent. And I can explain more in detail how this is done, because I think this is the key part of the algorithm. I have another slide if you want. No, No, the challenging thing is that DMS and chlorophyll, they are anti-correlated most of the time, especially in low latitudes. So going from here to here requires like using other variables to decouple DMS from chlorophyll while being able to take into account the changes of biomass in DMS production. That's the idea.
The question is about, I mean, I see that the plan is to make maps of the distributions and so on. And for making maps, you are based on these grids, and these grids can be more fine and more coarse. What is the limit from that? How define how the limit can be the grids in the maps?
So satellite observations So there is a trade-off always between the resolution you use and the coverage you get. So typical level 3 satellite products, which are like daily images, which are already composites of the primary images, they have a resolution of 4 kilometers, for example. These are the typical pixels in MODIs or other sensors like VIRS or Sentinel, but the actual resolution of the images is lower. It's in the hundreds of meters. But these are the local images, so you don't have a if you want to go want to do a local study, you can use these images. But for regional or global studies, it's better to use this beam image, which already have some processing. But then what happens if you go to daily images? The coverage you get is like this, maybe 10%. So you don't get, for most of your in situ measurements, you don't get matchups. Then if you move to weekly or typically 8-day images, you have maybe 30 or 40% coverage. But you are averaging over a long period, so maybe there is a more mismatch between your measurement, like at this particular moment, and the weekly period, right? Because lots of things happen over 1 week. So you have this trade-off, and the same in space because it's related. So if you go to 8-day images, you don't. It's pointless to go to this particular place because water is moving. So the more you open the temporal window, the farther you have to look. Also, no. Yeah.
Okay, more questions? Well, I have one. In terms of computing capability, is that really critical in this kind of work? Or you can, I mean, for instance, here you can just use your computers here or the clusters, or you need to go to the BSC. I've heard also that they are going to get a quantum computer there. Is that right, in the BSC? Yeah. Is that something that's going to be like a game changer or something for this research, or not? Do you just, there are other limitations?
Starting by the end, I don't know if quantum computing is going to, or in which ways quantum computing can have any impact, but for this particular like satellite processing chains, this can be run on a personal laptop. It would be very slow, but it's doable. But ideally, if you have a cluster like the one we have here, this runs in a few days. You can process the entire 20-year data set, for example. It depends also on the amount of variables you want and so on. But it's something we can do in the cluster here. But then, of course, if you have a supercomputer, it's much faster because you parallelize you do lots of tasks in parallel, and then it can run in minutes, perhaps. No, if you have thousands of cores to do that. But it's not particularly costly in terms of computing power to do this satellite processing the satellite processing we do for these products, at least. It's much more costly to run biogeochemical models like the 3D models with sufficient resolution.
Right. Nobody else has a question? Right, so then maybe we can just stop it here. Thank you very much again, Martí.
Thanks.